Good morning, Dan and Amy. Obamacare, remember that? I'm sure you do. You're living under it. I wonder what Obamacare plan Hillary has. Maybe that's something else that should be asked in terms of her disclosure, the kind of care she's getting versus the kind of care and associated costs regular Americans are getting, more perhaps more fodder for the ruling class rhetoric that Trump is using. I love this story, and we've talked about this issue before, what's happening in terms of people finding a solution around government central planning that negatively impacts their life. For example, the Obamacare gambit. This from the Daily Signal, which is the Heritage Foundation product. It's the story about Samaritan Ministries and the 184,000 people who are members of the Samaritan Ministries pool, if you will, of in terms of healthcare sharing costs. Healthcare sharing ministries where members, there's no health insurance company, members pay for a health event of another member. So you pool your resources, and I have a friend in one of these things too. So, for example, if somebody in the pool if I get sick, then you'll get a note saying you have to send $50 to Dan, and a bunch of other people say you have to send $50 to Dan for him to pay for this procedure he needs, and that's how it works. It's all a voluntary pool of health share of cost sharing for healthcare. What do you mean? What the heck is it? And then also you have the individual looking at places like the Oklahoma Surgery Center where they're putting market prices on different procedures, and you're cutting out the middlemen and all the bureaucracy and all the opacity of healthcare. It's just very interesting. Obamacare, domestic policy issues like Obamacare, still very important. And
the checks in the mail, by the way, to help you with your procedure.
Oh, we're not going to be in the same pool because I don't trust. I don't trust a timely disbursement from you, so that's not going to happen.
It's in the mail.
But our next guest is well positioned to talk about this, among other things. He is Tevi Troy. He's a former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, former White House aide. He's also the author of the new book, Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office, and perhaps in the Oval Office. Tevi Troy, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So your book kind of goes through all of the unexpected catastrophes that a president of the United States will encounter, things we can't predict, which is why we think about kind of skill sets and character so much, because we have to have confidence that this person is going to be able to handle whatever comes their way. And kind of what's the takeaway from reviewing how different presidents have handled different exigent circumstances?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dan. I think the issue that we're facing as American people right now is that we don't know what crises the next president may face, but we are confident and sure that they will face crises. There will be unexpected situations, and which candidate is better to handle them. And so through the book, I look at the history of different presidents and how they've handled crises and what we should look for in a president going forward.
And who has handled crises the best, in your opinion?
I give credit to a couple of presidents who handle it well in different areas. I give Franklin Delano Roosevelt credit for how he handled the communications around the Great Depression in terms of how he reassured the American people. Bill Clinton for helping to prevent the Y2K crisis. We don't know how bad it would have been, but he marshaled a lot of resources in terms of getting people ready for it. And I also give Ronald Reagan credit after the Tylenol poisonings of the mid-1980s, which took place here in Chicago. He really let the private sector, in terms of Johnson & Johnson, take the lead in making sure that the thing never happened again, the terrible poisonings. And so he allowed private sector initiative to help solve the problem.
And so you're looking at 2 aspirants to the Oval Office, and kind of what are the indicators that people should focus on in terms of making an assessment about which candidate, Trump or Hillary, would be best positioned, best able to handle whatever comes their way?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have worries in both camps on this regard. One thing that I found is that presidents have to be honest and truthful and trustworthy. If you go tell the American people that they need to take a vaccine, for example, this might happen if there's a flu of some sort, you need to have the American people be willing to trust that person. And Hillary, with her various email scandals and her long history of not being truthful and her recent health issues, I'm not sure she has the credibility with the American people. But also, when you're president, you need to to get up there and say things when you know all the facts and you're ready and you can't go off half-cocked. And Donald Trump, as we all know, has a propensity for saying things off the cuff that aren't necessarily the best thing to say at that time. So I have some worries in both regards. On the positive side, let me just briefly say, I think Donald Trump did a good job with the Louisiana floods when he went down there and showed compassion by handing out supplies. And Hillary Clinton has a good sense of all of the various mechanisms of government that would be brought into play during a crisis.
Well, what about President Obama? I mean, what kind of disasters did they face, and do you think that they handled them well?
I mean, in addition to his actual tenure.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that, and I talk about this in the book, early on, President Obama seemed a little overwhelmed by all the things that were coming at him. Remember the BP oil spill?
Yeah.
And then there was the 2009 swine flu, at point none of his appointees to HHS had yet been confirmed by the Senate. And then there was the pirate incident. It's not really a full-on disaster, but at one point, and I have this in the book, he said to his aides, "Who thought we were going to have to deal with pirates?" So there was just a sense that here was a guy who had not had executive experience, who was really beset by a whole bunch of problems and may not have been ready for all of it.
And what about some of the self-inflicted ones, mentioning Obamacare at the outset? You're a former deputy secretary of HHS, and you've also held a number of high-level policy positions for senators and in think tanks. What about Obamacare? What about the self-inflicted disasters?
Right. So I write a lot about Obamacare, know a lot about it. It's outside the kind of disaster I talk about in the book, but it clearly is a very problematic piece of legislation. It basically has become a high-cost subsidy for some low-income people, an add-on to Medicaid. The exchanges aren't working in terms of getting the number of healthy people you have to offset the sick people. You were talking before about that kind of cooperative, I guess, where people would help each other out. And for something like that to work, you need a lot of healthy people and not to be overwhelmed by sick people. The Obamacare exchanges have just the wrong number of people in terms of the risk pools.
So you knew Obamacare was going to be a disaster even before it was implemented?
I was one of these people who was very critical of Obamacare and warning about it beforehand, and I was concerned from the very beginning about some of these problems coming place. But I take no pleasure in the fact that they're coming to fruition.
Well, right. I mean, it's we have when we talk about disasters. I know you're talking about kind of natural disasters and things that are external, but what's the old Groucho Marx line about politicians creating the problems and then misapplying the wrong remedies? There's that aspect of it too. As you look at the threats that are on the horizon, which is what policymakers are doing, which is what the two presidential candidates and their supporting aides are doing, particularly in the international arena, but even things like disease. What are things that, as a policy advisor, you would be recommending either one of the candidates game plan for in anticipation of serving as president?
Yeah, I'll say two things in this regard. So first of all, because you don't know what could happen, I think each transition, and the transitions are active right now, should have what's called a black swan team to prepare for the unexpected. I know I worked on the Romney transition, and we did have a team like that was thinking about what happens if there's a massive flu outbreak or something like that. The other thing is there is one crisis, and it's related to what you were saying, Dan, that is completely predictable, which is the long-term fiscal crisis that we face. And if the next president is elected and serves 2 terms, they're going to serve into about 2025. And at that point, you really are facing the Medicare Trust Fund starting to go bankrupt and Medicaid payments going over $1 trillion a year and a whole bunch of fiscal issues, including the debt well over $20 trillion by that point, that could potentially lead to an economic collapse if we don't get smart about how to handle this kind of thing. So I think that's an utterly predictable crisis, and I think whoever is president needs to start dealing with it.
All right. He is Tevi Troy. He's a presidential historian, former White House aide, former deputy secretary of HHS. The book is Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office. Tevi, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.